We're going to be looking at 28 traps in the Ruy Lopez, ranging from beginner to very advanced and even Grandmaster level. Some of them are going to be simple, some of them are going to be very, very advanced, but they are all going to be tricky. And whether you play the Ruy Lopez with white or if you play e5 against e4 with black, I think all of them are going to be useful. If you would like to get the PGN for the traps, you can find the link in the description below. And once you finish the video, if you know of a trap in the Spanish that I haven't covered, please let me know. I'm going to be making part 2. The Noah's Ark trap is very simple. Basically, black is trying to trap the white bishop, and if white isn't careful, white's going to lose the bishop. It's in the modern Steinitz defense, so in a position where black plays d6. So bishop a4, d6. This is the modern Steinitz or the Steinitz. And white continues d4. White can also play c3 or castles, but d4 leads to this trap. Black plays b5 and bishop to b3. And now black takes on d4. Okay, white takes with the knight, black takes with the pawn, and in this position white has to play bishop d5 or c3. Those are the good moves. Queen d4 falls for the trap. If you try to take the pawn, then you simply lose a bishop. You can see that the c pawn is marching down the board. So c5 and c4 is going to win the bishop. After c5, let's say queen d5, white threatens the rook, but now simply bishop e6, and the bishop is lost after the queen moves away. You can try a couple more checks, but now it's game over. The rook's defended, and the bishop falls. So that's the Noah's Ark trap. So remember that in this position, after d4, you should really only take twice. Knight d4, knight d4, e d4, and don't take with the queen. This pawn is marching up the board. The next position is also extremely famous. This is called the Mortimer Trap. It comes in the Mortimer variation of the Ruy Lopez. Once again, the same position. After bishop b5, this is a trap for black. Black continues knight f6, which is one of the most common moves, the Berlin defense. And after d3, avoiding the Berlin endgame, black plays this extremely weird move, knight e7. And this is the Mortimer variation or the Mortimer Trap. Well, what's the point from an advanced perspective? Well, first of all, the pawn should not be taken. That's falling for the trap. I'm going to show you what happens. But the point for black is that after castles, something like c6, bishop a4, the knight transfers to g6, and that's a very natural square. So knight e7 is not a bad move. There's a strategic idea behind it. However, it also sets up the trap. If the pawn is taken, white is dead lost. After pawn to c6, the bishop is attacked, and black is threatening queen a5, picking up the knight, because that's a double attack on the king and on the knight. So if the bishop moves away, for example, bishop a4, then queen a5 check just picks up the knight or picks up the bishop, doesn't really matter. If the bishop moves to c4, then we don't get a choice of which piece we're going to take, but queen a5 still picks up the knight. I should mention one tricky line for white. White can try to play knight c4, threatening mate in 1, so be careful. Don't fall for this. If you take the bishop, then this is checkmate. So after knight c4, you just move your knight away, and then you're going to win a piece again. Even though you're not winning the knight on e5, after the bishop moves away, you have b5, forking both pieces and winning the game. Before I show you the Smothered Mate trap, I would like to thank Chessbook, who are sponsoring today's video. Chessbook is the best way to work on your repertoire. It's easy to navigate, it's easy to use, it's very understandable, and it's extremely useful. You know that I work on openings a lot, and using Chessbook has improved my studying process significantly. So what can you do with Chessbook? Chessbook allows you to import and study your repertoire. It's as simple as that. You can do it by importing a PGN, which is what I do. That's the simplest way to do it. So you simply upload a file, let's say like this, and submit it, and it will recognize the PGN as your repertoire. You can do that for either color, let's say, yeah, keep my entire repertoire, or you can do it by hand. Now, I've imported the PGN for the traps that I'm about to show you. And if you would like that PGN, it's in the description below. But you can also do that by hand. So let's say I want to import the Noah's Ark Trap as my black repertoire. So we go e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, a6, bishop to a4, d6, d4, very standard, b5. Okay, I'm importing just the Noah's Ark Trap. After bishop to b3, we take on d4. And after knight takes d4, if knight takes d4, e takes d4, the Noah's Ark Trap is queen takes d4. So let's keep adding moves. So let's say queen takes d4. We now win by playing the move c5. And black is going to win the bishop. White's best is queen to d5. We go bishop e6 defending the rook. They go queen c6 check. We go bishop to d7, and now that's it. After queen to d5, we now go c4, and the bishop is lost. So let's save the moves to my repertoire. Now what you can do is you can practice these moves. Of course, you can practice your entire repertoire, but let's say I just want to practice the Noah's Ark. So as soon as you import something, you can practice it. So let's see how well I do. Okay, a6, bishop to a4, we go d6, they go d4, we go b5, chasing the bishop away to d3, then we take on d4, we take again, we go c5, bishop e6, bishop d7, and we go bishop. Why did I forget this? Ah, sorry, stupid. We just go c4 here. Okay, I was going to make another bishop move. Okay, so that's what you can do. Now, you can import a limited number of moves in the basic version of Chessbook, but the premium version, which allows you to import an unlimited number of moves, is only $5 a month. There are two more things you can do. Now, I haven't been playing the Spanish a lot, so there are no mistakes in my games, but you can connect your Lichess and Chess.com accounts and it will immediately recognize the mistake you'd made in your games based on your repertoire. So that's a great way to practice the mistakes you already made. What you can also do is you can play through a model game. It's going to find the model game in your opening, and you can go through the game guessing the Grandmaster's moves, and that's going to be extremely useful. If you would like to check out Chessbook, and please do, there's a link in the description below. Check them out, see if you find it useful, and let me know what you think. Thanks, guys. The Neo-Archangel Smothered Mate is one of my favorite traps. Now, the Neo-Archangel starts after a6, bishop a4, bishop c5. Okay, this is probably could still be called the classical or something like that, but after knight f6, we are now in the Neo-Archangel. So white plays c3, that's one of the most common moves, and black normally plays b5, and the variation continues b5, bishop b3, d6, and it's a normal Neo-Archangel. The point of the Archangel is to play b5 quickly. But we play bishop a7. Now, you could also set up the trap probably after b5, but this just avoids d4 coming with tempo. So it's a good way to set up the trap. If white continues rook e1, which is okay, then we go knight g4. And you can see that d4 isn't going to be as effective because the bishop isn't on c5 and we're threatening to take on f2. So when d4 comes, we take, c takes, and knight takes. Now, this seems fairly risky because after knight takes, there's queen h4 for black. Okay, so maybe white shouldn't have played rook e1, but it's an extremely natural looking move to punish bishop to a7 because it supports the e-pawn and doesn't allow knight e4. Okay, so after queen h4, what should white do? White's best move is bishop e3. And after queen h2, there are no more checks. King f1, and that's about it. In this position, black is simply a piece down, and there's nothing there. However, after queen h4, black can make a mistake. There's knight f3, defending the pawn on h2 and attacking the queen. And after knight f3, this is a smothered mate. Queen takes f2, king h1, queen g1 mate, and doesn't matter what they take with, let's say rook takes, then there's knight f2, checkmate. So in this position, after rook e1, knight g4 is an extremely tricky move. d4 takes, c takes, knight takes, and black just gave away a piece, but queen h4 is extremely tricky. Remember this trap. This is actually something I've included in my repertoire as an idea, this move bishop to a7. It has only been played 30 times in master games. People usually play b5. Another Archangel trap, this time from the white side. So we're going into the main line Archangel now. We're not going to be in the Neo-Archangel. So bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and b5. This is the proper Archangel variation where black tries to fianchetto the bishop as quickly as possible before moving the d-pawn. Okay, the bishop goes to b3, the bishop goes to b7, and d3 is the main line. d3 is the best move, but c3 is something that sets up a trap. It's also one of the main moves. It has been played 1,000 times in master games. And in this position, black should take on e4. That's fine. White continues d4. That's also fine. And ed4 is okay, but it's pretty risky. I think the best move for black is knight a5, and that's going to be easier to play. But if black plays e takes d4, then even though black is equal according to the engine, or about equal, it's extremely hard to play. White goes rook e1. And now good luck defending. I mean, your only move really is d5. And when you go d5, we go knight g5, and black can go bishop to e7 or queen to d7. Let's say queen to d7, then we go f3, h6, knight takes f7, and it gets pretty complicated, but it should be equal. fe4, castles queenside. This position should be about equal. But I want to show you a blunder, because rook e1 actually sets up a trap. If black does not play d5, if black plays f5, this is game over. After f5, we go c takes d4. Okay, they go... I don't know what to suggest. The engine says bishop b4 is the best move, but let's say bishop to e7 unpinning and trying to castle. Then knight c3, double pressure on the knight, and if knight takes, then bc3. Now the bishop is pinned. If they castle, oh well, that's illegal because the bishop is here. If they play, let's say d6, then we have knight g5, and black is completely collapsing. Let's say, well, what do we suggest? Bishop c8 defending e6, for example, then knight f7, and it's game over. And if they play the best move, after f5, cd4, if they play bishop b4, which doesn't lose immediately, or doesn't lose as easily, then we just go knight c3. This knight has to be taken, bc3. Let's say queen f6, preparing to castle queenside, bishop g5, let's say queen g6, I think that's the best move, and now simply queen c1 defending the bishop, and we are dominating the board. This isn't a position in which you win the queen, but it's overwhelming according to the engine, and visually from a human perspective, this knight is pinned, these bishops are amazing, black is never going to castle, this knight doesn't really have a square except for a5. So remember this, when you go rook e1 in the Archangel, if they go f5, you have a winning position after c takes d4. You're basically freeing up a square for the knight. Now, we're going to have a look at a position from the bird variation. I call this Blackburne's trap. Now we're looking at the move knight d4. This is the bird variation, and it gained in popularity again in the last 10 or so years. There's a game, Ivan Šarić versus Carlsen, where Šarić, who is the Croatian strongest player, beat Carlsen from this position. Now, of course, white takes, knight takes d4. E takes d4, we are still following Sharich-Carlsen, of course, castles. And now, in this position, bishop c5 is the best move, although black can also go c6. But g6 was played in this game, and this is a pretty rare move. It has only been played about 20 times. White played d3. This is from the game Alekhine-Blackburne from 1914. Bishop to g7, and f4 was played by Alekhine. And after f4, white has a pretty dominant position here, and it seems like white's position is great. So c6, bishop c4 was played, bishop a4 could have also been played, and now d5 by Blackburne. And in this position, bishop b3 is definitely a logical move, but Alekhine took e takes d5. And after c takes d5, he went bishop b5 check. Now, after king f8, it seems like Blackburne's position is, well, sort of ruined. The king is on f8, but black is actually better. Why? Well, this bishop doesn't really have a lot of squares. And white actually has to waste a tempo to save the bishop straight away, because black is threatening to win the bishop with a move like queen a5. So what white should do is bishop a4, which seems absurd in this position, because then black gets to play knight e7 and continue developing. Instead, Alekhine played knight d2, incredibly allowing queen a5, and the game is over. If a4, there's simply a6 and the bishop is lost. If b4, that doesn't matter, just queen c7. The bishop has 0 squares. So this to me was very instructive. This could actually happen in a game fairly easily. So if g6, which, I mean, you can set up the trap with other moves as well, but when white plays d3, that's the key move that sort of traps the bishop, and after d6 or d5, c6 or c5, the queen has a way into a5. So remember this trap. Moving on, I want to show you the simplest trap in the Ruy Lopez, which I've seen happen many times. And I've explained this many times to many people who don't really play chess. If you're a beginner and you play the Ruy Lopez or you play e5 with black, just please know this. So a6, bishop a4, b5, okay, bishop b3. Now, knight d4 is a move that, well, isn't good. I've seen it played. Knight d4 is just a bad move. Why? You don't take on f7 first, even though that has been played. Black is better after bishop takes f7. Instead, you play knight takes d4, and after e takes d4, now you take on f7, and the game is over. If the king doesn't take, then we really have nothing to analyze. If king takes, then queen h5. And after g6, this is a very, very common maneuver, queen d5 check, and we're gonna win the rook in the corner. If instead the king goes to e7, then it's the same story here, and the king has to step onto a light square, so king f7, and again queen d5. So remember this. I've seen this happen many times, this idea with knight d4. I don't know what the point is. They probably want to win the bishop, but it simply doesn't work. I should also mention that knight takes e5 is a bad move because of queen g5, and this attacks the knight and attacks the g-pawn, so this could be one of the ideas. So the pawn cannot be taken, but instead you take the knight on d4, and then you take on f7. Why doesn't bishop takes f7 work immediately? Well, after bishop takes f7, king takes f7. If you play knight d4 now and they take, you are transposing, but they don't have to transpose. They go queen h4. And if you recapture, then the queen starts grabbing stuff. Okay, so that was a beginner's trap, but still, it's a move I've seen played many times. Starting with the exchange variation traps, I'm going to show you probably the most famous one first. And this is in the line where black tries to checkmate white and offers a bishop for that. So a6, bishop takes, d takes castles, standard, and now here black can play f6, bishop d6, many moves, but bishop g4 is one of them. And bishop g4 simply defends the pawn. Now, if white plays h3, which is a good move, black can do two different things. Black can retreat the bishop, or three things: take on f3 or go h5. And h5 is the trickiest of all. If h5, the bishop cannot be taken, we're going to see a trap later on where white plays d3, which is the best move. We're going to see a more advanced trap deeper down the line. But let me just show you what happens if the bishop is taken. If pawn takes bishop, then pawn takes. And this here is one of the most famous attacking patterns. I've used this in the Nimzo Indian a lot when I have a bishop on g5 and they play h6 and then I go h4. And I would like to open up my rook. In this case, the knight has 0 squares. White's best is d3 actually. And after d3, gf3, queen f3, queen h4, queen h3, and just black ends up, material up with a winning position. If knight e1, this we don't really have to analyze here, and after f4 we go g3, that's going to be checkmate. Or if knight h2, that's even simpler, we just go queen h4. The best move is rook e1, giving the king a square, and it's game over. So this position, the bishop cannot be taken. Remember this trap. I've actually had it on the board with black and with white, but I haven't taken the bishop with white, of course. And when I had black, my opponent did not take the bishop. Now something a bit more advanced in the same variation. So after a6, bishop takes, d takes castles, bishop g4, h3, h5. Let's see what should be played. First of all, if bishop h5, I just want to point something out, then g4, bishop g6, knight e5 is fine for black, even though black had given up a pawn. And black should continue queen to h4. I'm sorry. If black takes the pawn on e4, then black is losing after rook e1 and f6 and knight d3. And this bishop is going to fall. So that's just one detail. But back to this. After h5, d3 is white's best. You don't take the bishop. Black continues queen f6. Knight bd2 is still the mainline stuff. Knight e7 mainline stuff. Rook e1, knight g6, preparing to come to the f4 square. And in this position, white should continue with d4. And after knight f4, you can actually take the bishop, and the position is about equal. H takes g4, and now g3. You're going to give the piece back. After gf3, queen f3, the knight has to move back, and now d5, queen e5. This should be about equal. I prefer white's position slightly, even though the king is relatively unsafe, because black has these bad pawns, of course, and white has a pawn majority on the king side. However, there's a very common mistake here that people keep playing, and that's the move queen e2. The idea is relatively natural. You want to go queen e3 if knight f4, defending all the squares and preparing to put your rook to d1 or on d1 at some point. But this loses straight away. Knight f4, queen e3, and now bishop h3. And if you don't take the bishop, I'm going to take on g2. I mean, you have to take the bishop. And when you take the bishop, we don't take on h3. We play bishop c5. And this is the incredible part. And after bishop c5, what can white do? If the bishop is taken, then that's the simplest variation. Queen g6 check, queen g2 mate. Or if d4, then simply, well, not bishop d4. Because knight takes, but ed4, yeah, and I mean, again, you have to take. You don't have a single square for your queen, except if you go this way, and if you play, for example, queen to b3, then there's again queen g6 and queen g2. Sorry, you can lose the knight, I guess. You can play here, but queen takes g5. And then you can cover with the queen, but you're a piece down. So if queen c5, that's simple. If d4, ed4, you cannot move your queen. So knight d4, and now once again bishop d4, and the bishop again cannot be taken. If you If you take the bishop, it's the same thing here. So let's say queen f3 defending against mate, but now queen h4 and h3 is collapsing. And that's the end of the game. For example, if knight c4, you can actually take on f2 because you get to fork the king and queen in the end. So queen f2 is forced and knight h3 wins immediately. So if white knows what they're doing with d3, you may still catch them in this trap if they go queen e2. Okay. So that was sort of the advanced trap in the exchange variation. Another one in the exchange variation is something I've seen before and something I've had happen in one of my games. So a6, bishop takes d takes, castles, and now bishop d6. This is one of the main moves. After d4, black should go pawn takes, of course, and after queen takes f6, this is the main line. This I've had many times. But if they go bishop g4, this is a simple blunder because you can take on e5. And in this position, bishop takes f3 should be played, and after queen f3, bishop e5, and white should have a significant advantage, almost +1. However, if black isn't careful and black takes the pawn on e5, then it's game over. So queen d8, rook d8, and this is a free bishop. This I've actually had in a blitz game online. Unbelievably. My opponent was 2300 or something like that. He wasn't low rated. Another trap in the exchange variation, we will be looking at the main lines now. So takes, takes, castles, and f6. This is the main move. Now white goes d4, e takes d4, knight takes d4. And of course, in this position, the move is c5. And after c5, knight b3, queen d1, rook takes queen, and so on. But this move I've also faced. And I have to say, I faced this 10 times. Bishop c5. And whenever I see this move, I cannot believe my eyes. So this attacks the knight. I mean, it's not like you would take the knight after c3. So I don't understand the move at all. But the worst part is that the queen h5 just picks up the bishop. Unbelievably, people do this. So remember, just remember that queen h5 picks up the bishop. This has been played 4,000 times on lichess, and I had it, I want to say 3 or 4 times. Now, one more trap in the f6 line, but a bit more advanced this time. So takes, takes, castles, f6, d4, e takes, knight takes, and c5, the main move, knight b3, queen takes, rook takes, and bishop d6. This is all fine. White plays knight a5, putting pressure on the b7 pawn, and black should play b5. This is the most annoying move and the move I face most often. But there is something black could try to do to, well, ruin your position and ruin your plans by castling queenside quickly. This I've had twice in my games. I've been playing the exchange Spanish a lot in training games, and I've had people play bishop g4. Now, this prepares to castle queenside and then play bishop h2, winning the rook on d1. So after the most natural move for white, f3 attacking the bishop, black doesn't move the bishop, black castles queenside. And now if you play something like f takes, then bishop h2, king h2, rook takes d1. And in this position, black is actually better. Black has a rook for 2 pieces, but all of these are pinned, and it's going to be very hard to develop. Okay, so black should be better. However, white has a winning move here. We can attack both bishops at once. Why? Well, because after e5, if bishop takes, then we exchange rooks and take the bishop on g4. And if pawn takes, this bishop is now blocked. There is no bishop h2. You just take the bishop on g4 and that's the end of the game. I've had this, and I'm happy to say that I was not prepared for this. I actually found it on my own. And this is probably my favorite one since I managed to find it over the board. I did not know the move bishop g4. I was pretty confused when I faced it for the first time. f3 I played instantly, and after castles I spent probably 10 minutes trying to figure out what to do. And my first intention was to go knight c3. It seemed like a reasonable move, but then I found e5 and it's game over. So remember this one. This could happen on a higher level. I mean, this isn't a beginner's trap, and it's definitely not a beginner's solution. One more in the exchange variation, and this just... I wanted to point out that the exchange Spanish is not the Petrov. There are many traps in the Ruy Lopez that start in positions similar to other openings. And many people are going to be confusing positions. This is the simplest example, probably. So after a6 takes, castles, what if black plays knight f6? This is a very simple blunder because, well, they're trying to play the Petrov with all of this inserted. Unfortunately, the white king is already on g1, so we can just take on e5, and the pawn on e4 cannot be taken. If knight takes e4, then rook e1, and we win very, very simply. If, for example, queen d5, then we go d4, and next we're gonna be moving our f-pawn. If they insert f6, we can just move the knight and win. So after knight e5, black usually tries bishop d6. I've had this happen. And now you don't play knight c4 because knight c4 fails to bishop h2. I actually saw this during my game. I think my opponent was going for this. King h2, knight g4, and this is fairly standard stuff where the queen is coming out eventually. And this should be equal, but instead you play the move knight f3, and now you have another threat. You're threatening to fork the bishop and knight, and it's game over. Black cannot castle, and black has to move one of the pieces somewhere. Well, knight d7 is what my analysis was. After knight d7, we go d4, and the bishop probably has to move somewhere, because if this is captured, then rook e1. So after bishop e7, d4, and the pawns are rolling forward, white should be winning. And after knight f3, if the bishop moves, then we simply go rook e1. And again, if they castle, then d3, and this position should be huge for white. This should be a huge advantage. For example, bishop e6, which isn't really a great move, but we just continue knight c3, we continue developing, and we have excellent pieces, great control of the center, and we should be winning. So knight f6, we can punish it simply by taking on e5. Bishop d6 does not work. You go knight f3 and you win. The last one in the exchange variation I would like to show you is a trap that starts after knight e5. This is the simplest one. Of course, I did not play this as white, but I've seen a student of mine play this when he didn't know the opening. He played bishop b5 because he saw that that was a popular opening, and then he took on c6 because he didn't know what else to do, and then when he saw a free pawn, he took the pawn. So this is the simplest trap of all, and this is a common pattern in the Ruy Lopez. The pawn on e5 cannot be taken because of queen d4, and now black has a significant advantage. Black is forking the pawn and the knight. Let's say knight g4, queen e4, knight e3. This is the best white could hope for. It's just a bad position, and black should be much better. Not winning, but much better. And black has the bishop pair in an open position with an active queen. Don't do this. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you what happens if black tries to trap the bishop. a6, bishop a4, b5. Okay, this is very standard, but what if black tries to play a5, a4? This is what I call trying to trap the bishop and failing. I don't know if the trap has a name, but okay. So, they go a5. trying to trap your bishop. Of course, we don't go a3, we go a4, okay? And we're not losing the bishop. They go b4, this is the only sensible move, and now white has to punish this expansion by striking in the center, and white goes d4. Now black's best is e takes d4, and after castles, probably bishop c5, knight g5, better for white, definitely better for white. There's pressure on f7, and this is a good way to punish what black was doing, but black can also lose straight away. If after d4 they go bishop d6, and the only reason I know this is because I had it happen in a blitz game, and at first I didn't see it, but here I saw it actually. It was in a 15-minute game. After bishop d6, the game is over. So d5, knight e5, knight e5, bishop e5, and queen d5. And everything is hanging. The rook, the bishop, the pawn on f7 with checkmate. It's just game over. So I won a game in 10 moves. And if they go a5, you go a4. If they go b4, you go d4. And they should take with a worse position, but bishop d6 is immediately over. I understand bishop d6. It looks nice. You want to take, you want to do this, get the queen to h4. But after this, it's game over. Let's look at an anti-Marshall trap. So after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, we are finally going into the main lines. Bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles. Okay. Now, if you go c3, then the Marshall with d5. There are many anti-Marshall openings for white. You can go a4, you can go h3, or you can go d4, which is what we're looking at in this game. So we're looking at an anti-Marshall bishop sacrifice. So after d4, black has options. d6 is okay, knight d4 is also okay. d6 is the main move. e4 is probably playable, but uncommon. After knight takes d4, white can just recapture, but white can also sacrifice the bishop. Bishop takes f7. And if you turned on the engine in this position, it's going to say that it's completely equal, and rook takes f7 is a better move. If king takes f7, it should still be equal, but you're losing the pawn with check, so it doesn't really make too much sense. So after rook f7, white plays knight e5, and black should continue rook f8. This is the best move. It's equal. After rook f8, queen takes d4 is an equal position. Something like c5, the queen drops back, and then bishop b7 should be fine for black. However, after knight takes e5, there's a blunder that seems very human-like, and the move is knight e6. So black is trying to save the knight, allowing white to capture the rook, and black is hoping to get two pieces for a rook. But this loses immediately. After knight takes f7, king takes f7, we now go e5. And what's the point? Well, the knight has to move. If it moves, you have queen f3. Winning the rook in the corner. So the knight cannot move. This has actually happened in 2 Grandmaster games, and in both games, black played king g8. And after ef6, of course, white was up the exchange and won convincingly in both games. So after e5, knight e8 fails simply, queen f3, and that's it. After king g8, queen a8. Knight g8 fails for the same reason. If bishop b7, which is also a playable variation, now we can go e takes f6. And after bishop f6, there have actually been 2 games from here. One of them black won, one of them was a draw, although I don't understand why. It makes no sense to me. White is +3, so I don't know. So in the d4 anti-Marshall, if they take on d4, try this. Try bishop takes f7. You're not going to be worse. It's equal. it's equal, but after rook f7, knight e5, if they try this, if they try knight e6, the game is over because of this trick. Knight takes, king takes, e5, and that's it. Moving on to the Open Spanish, we're going to be looking at a move that Karpov first employed against Korchnoi in 78. And this was Karpov's very, very famous piece sacrifice. And it has been played by Kasparov in his 95 World Championship against Anand as well. So it's something that Karpov and Kasparov have played, although Karpov was first. So let's get into the Open Spanish. So bishop a4, knight f6, castles, and now knight takes e4 is the Open Spanish. d4, b5, bishop b3, d5, this is all mainline stuff. d5, bishop e6, still main line, knight d2, knight c5, c3, d4. Okay, now, there are different moves in this position. We're going to be looking at bishop e6, which is the main line in the next trap. But Karpov's piece sacrifice idea was knight g5. Now what does this do? This seems absurd. And if black doesn't know this, then you know you could win some games fairly quickly. The only good move is to take the knight. And I'm going to show you the compensation white gets. If black doesn't take the knight, let's say for example bishop takes b3. After bishop b3, knight b3, white is winning. I don't know what to suggest for black. Let's say knight b3, queen b3. There's pressure on f7. Let's say queen d7. We now simply go e6, and white is going to win the game. After knight g5, if, for example, h6, trying to chase the knight away, then it's even simpler. Knight e6, f e6, queen h5. And again, game over. After king d7, we just take on d4. What else? If knight takes b3, then again knight e6, f e6, knight b3, and we're going to play queen h5. After dc3, queen h5, g6, queen h3, white has a great position. So you basically have to accept this sacrifice. Now what's the point? After queen takes g5, we go queen f3. Okay, and the best way for black to play is to castle queenside, give the knight back. We play bishop e6, f e6, and queen c6, and this should be about level. It should be about equal. However, after queen f3, if black tries to hold on to the piece, this is the trap. If bishop to d7, trying to save the knight, then this is too dangerous. Bishop takes f7, not queen takes, king e7, and bishop to d5. And you're going to be losing that piece anyway, because the rook is hanging in the corner. I should also mention that in this position, if the king goes to d8, it's even simpler. We just take on d4, and if knight takes, then queen a8, and if the knight moves away, let's say to e6, then bishop takes e6, bishop e6, and queen c6 again is going to be game over. So this one is fairly advanced, knight g5, but it's one of the most venomous ways to play the Open Spanish. Again, study Karpov, Korchnoi, and Kasparov Anand for more information. The next trap in the Open Spanish was actually by Tarrasch, by Siegbert Tarrasch. So let's get into the same position again. So knight e4, same position. And in this position, after bishop e7, in this position we're looking at bishop e7, not bishop c5. After bishop e7, there are two moves, knight bd2 and rook e1. And rook e1 was played, which is also okay. This was played by Carlsen, Yu Yang-Yi, Grishchuk. It's a fairly common move. Black castles, and white goes knight to d4. Now, if knight e5, this is playable for black. Knight d4 should be the best move for black. So those two, I'm not going to analyze them for you here. You can look at them yourselves. They are pretty theoretical and complicated, but there's a losing blunder here. And that's queen d7. Now, queen d7 looks like an extremely logical move because it defends the knight, and it creates this battery with bishop and queen. However, the game is over straight away. This blunder I've seen happen in a blitz game in my club about 3 or 4 years ago. That's how I know it. And they told me, yeah, this is the Tarrasch, whatever. Okay, so after queen d7 you take the bishop and black resigns. If f e6, then simply rook e4, the queen is hanging. And after knight e6, if queen e6, then once again rook e4 and the queen is hanging. You cannot take back and white wins a piece. So this position is fairly common. And again, knight d4 should be played, or knight e5. Knight e5, let me show it to you for a second. Knight e5 is playable, but it's weird. After f3, both knights are hanging. But there's bishop d6, f e4, and c5. And black gets compensation for the piece by playing c4. After knight f5, bishop f5, ef5, c4 should be okay for black. The engine says equal. I don't understand this very well, so I wouldn't go into this as black. Just remember that queen d7 is losing straight away. The most advanced trap of all 28 traps that I'm going to show you today is what I call the 20 moves of theory trap. If you are an advanced player, learn this. If you play the Ruy Lopez, this could be useful. So once again, let's get into the open Spanish. So knight e4, b5 and mainline stuff. And now we're looking at bishop e6, which is the main move. And what you're going to see here is these were the first 11 moves. The next 9 moves are also mainline theory, and especially in the 70s and 80s. So this was a very famous variation. Knight e6, because of Korchnoi, I presume. cd4, knight cd4, knight e4, all mainline stuff. You can find hundreds of games from this position. Bishop e3, and these are the best moves. Okay, knight f5, queen c2 declining the queen trade, black castles, rook a1, still main line stuff. Okay, knight takes e3, f takes e3, queen c8, trying to get the rook to the d file, and preparing to play c5 in some positions. So knight d4, okay, knight takes d4, e takes d4, and queen e6, okay, capturing this square. Now white should continue with g3, with knight g3. Pawn to d5 cannot be played because the e5 pawn is hanging. So knight g3 and f6. Okay, in this position we are still following a couple of games. Black was played by John Nunn and Artur Yusupov, so obviously very strong players. Knight f5, and in this position both players have played this losing blunder. Now what should be played is bishop b4, which is a very strange move, allowing queen c7, and after rook f7, queen c2 is about equal after rook d8. About equal. After knight f5, f takes e5 is losing, which seems weird. F e5 is losing because of queen to b3. And white won both games. What's the point? The bishop is hanging, the queen is hanging. If you take the queen, I take the bishop with check, and your king cannot defend on f7 because there's a rook on f1. If you move the bishop, I just win your queen. If you play rook f6 defending the queen, I take the bishop. So the best move is queen b3. And that's it. Okay, both games went queen b3, and that was the end of the game. This is incredible. 20 moves down a very famous line after knight f5. Yusupov and John Nunn have played f takes e5, losing the game immediately. So knight f5 is a very, very tricky line, and probably the most advanced trap of all that you're going to be seeing today. Another open Spanish trap, this time a bit simpler. So once again, d4, b5, bishop b3. In this position, we saw d5 every game. Of course, d5 is the main move. What happens on e takes d4? Well, e takes d4 is much better for white, but it's not immediately winning yet. Rook e1 should be the best move, but knight d4 is okay. White is better. And now if knight c5, we win. This seems like a logical move, gets the knight away from the e file, attacks the bishop, but now simply knight takes c6, and if the knight is taken, then bishop takes f7. I've seen this in a blitz game, and it's a low-level trap, but you still have to know it. If instead of d5 they go e d4, you can take this, and now you're threatening to go rook e1. So if they move the knight away, this, I think queen f6 is the best move, but if you take, bishop f7. The next one is in the Steinitz defense, so we're looking at d6, okay, and this is the Tarrasch trap. This is a very famous trap. d4, bishop d7 is okay, knight c3. Okay, if knight c3, we are still in the main lines, and black should continue knight f6 or e d4. Those are very common, but bishop e7 is the losing blunder. Now, after bishop e7, white played castles, and the game went castles immediately, losing the advantage. After castles, black is okay if they take on d4. Okay, so I'm going to show you the same pattern that happened later in the game that should have been played immediately to win this position. And what's the pattern? After bishop e7, we have a very, very simple win with bishop takes c6, bishop takes c6, and d takes e5. Now, if you don't take on e5, I don't know what else, so you have nowhere to develop your pieces. So after d5, this is the trick. Queen takes d8, rook takes d8, and knight takes e5. And white is completely winning. A pawn up with an excellent knight, a lead in development, and just a great position. The game went castles, and black played knight f6, white played rook e1, and black played castles. Okay, and now the same trick worked. Bishop takes c6, bishop c6, d5, d5, queen d8, rook a d8, knight e5, and this was winning. I'm going to show you what his opponent played. He played bishop e4, which isn't a good move. Knight e4, knight e4, and now of course you don't play rook takes losing, you go knight d3, and the pieces are hanging. f5, f3, and the game is over. So this is the Tarrasch trap. This is something to remember because it's highly likely it could happen. This bishop e7 seems like a relatively human move to make, but it loses a pawn and it gives up the position straight away. Just remember that you don't castle like Tarrasch did, you take on c6 straight away. Now we're looking at the improved Steinitz trap, or the improved Steinitz trap. So knight f6, the Berlin, castles, and d6. And this is the improved Steinitz defense with knight f6 inserted. I will just call it the Steinitz. Rook e1, which is fine, bishop d7, which is fine, c3, and now bishop to e7. Now this may seem similar to the previous position, but it doesn't work because now if this and this, you cannot take on e5. So after bishop e7, d4, okay, and castles. And after castles, white should play bishop a4 or d5. Those are the normal moves. If white plays knight bd2, black is better. Knight bd2 is just a pawn blunder because this bishop is loose, which is why we had to play bishop a4 or d5. In this position, simply knight takes d4 wins some material. If c takes d4, bishop takes b5, and black has the bishop pair, and it will not keep the extra pawn because of this. However, black is better with the bishop pair in an open position, and white basically has no center. So remember this: if bishop e7, d4, castles, white should continue d5 or bishop a4. If knight bd2, very, very simple trick. And this has happened many times. This happened in 16 Grandmaster games, and on lichess it happened like 2,000 times. Okay. The Berlin endgame. We're going to be looking at two traps in the Berlin, so let's get into it. Knight f6 castles, knight takes e4, which is the main line, rook e1, and from here knight d6, which is the main move. And knight takes e5 is how you get into the Berlin endgame. But let's have a look at the move knight c3. Now knight c3 is only a slight advantage to black, so it's not a bad attempt. Knight e5, of course, would have been better. So if knight takes b5, which is black's best, then white plays knight takes e5. Okay, and black cannot take the knight, of course. Black should go bishop e7 with a slight advantage. After knight e5, if they take, then we go rook e5, we are better. And after bishop e7, we don't take this knight. If we take this knight, is good. That's good for black, because now c6 and the rook gets chased away, and I don't know, let's say rook b3, a5, the rook is almost trapped. If c6 and the rook tries to transfer to the king side, then we go d6, and these bishops are too strong, the rook is too loose, and black just has a huge advantage. So we don't take the knight. That's not the point. The point is knight d5, and this is game over. The best move for black is probably d6, I don't know, or king f8. If king f8, then rook e7. And on c6, we don't have to move the knight and lose the rook. We play queen f3. And you can see that black should resign. f6 is the only move. And now just queen g4, reinforcing the threat. If rook g8, then we can move our rook away. Let's say rook e3. If they take the knight, then queen b4 check, and we take theirs. So this is not an easy trap. It's fairly advanced. So try this move knight c3. If they take the bishop, you take on e5. And black, of course, should take knight e5. And after rook e5, bishop e7, knight d5. Game over. The next one was played by Simon Winawer, the guy whom the famous French variation was named after. It's also in the Berlin, so knight f6, castles, knight e4, and now queen e2. Queen e2 is, of course, not the most famous move. d4, rook e1 are more common, but queen e2 is playable. Okay, knight d6, the only move that makes any sense. Bishop takes c6, d takes c6, and queen takes e5. This has been played many times. Michael Adams played it, Arkady Naiditch, Dmitry Andreikin, many famous players. Queen e7 is the main move. And now queen a5, declining the trade. Okay, now black should continue with queen d8 or queen d7. This is what grandmasters play, trying to free up the bishop, defending the c7 pawn, and just a safe move. Preparing to meet rook e1 with bishop e7. Winawer's opponent played bishop e6, which seems natural. It's not losing or anything, it's about equal. Winawer just played pawn to d3, and knight f5 was played. Knight f5 is okay, it's not too bad. It's slightly dubious, but it allows this queen to come into the game and challenge on the queen side. White continued bishop f4, which is okay, and for some reason black castled queenside. I don't get that. Black should probably continue queen b4, and the position is equal. After castling queenside, queen a7 was played, and now if queen c5, probably white is still winning, but it's not immediately over. Instead, queen b4 was played, attacking the bishop, attacking the pawn on b2, and this move is just a blunder. If white moves the bishop, then of course black is almost fine, but there's knight e5, and now there's no way to defend against checkmate unless you give up your queen. So this I thought was a fairly nice miniature, and this pattern of the knight coming to e5 and the queen blasting through the queen side seemed interesting. Of course, it's hard for black to castle king side. It's gonna take a couple of moves, so I mean, castling queen side is absurd, but it's not, it's understandable. The next one is very famous. It's Tiviakov's idea of playing Queen e2, and this is called the Wormald attack, although I don't know why. I think this should be called the Tiviakov attack, if you want to give it a name. So bishop a4, knight f6, and now of course castles is a million games, d3 is thousands of games, but Queen e2. This is the Wormald attack, or let's call it Tiviakov's attack. Okay, bishop e7 is the standard way to face this. Castles, b5, very, very standard, and d6, and a4. Now a4 tries to undermine the queen side, and there are a couple of ways to play this. Black can play bishop to d7, black can play bishop g4, black can play rook b8. I think rook b8 is the most understandable human move. However, if b4, the point of a4 was not only to attack the b5 pawn, but also to provoke b4, then white is winning in a single move. Queen c4 with a fork. And this has happened before in 2 Grandmaster games. White, of course, won both. Black played queen d7. I mean, whatever you do, it's just bad. After queen takes f7, king d8, there's queen takes g7, and of course black should resign. I should also mention that after queen c4, if you castle, then just queen takes knight. So this is a very interesting trap. This position is probably going to happen. This is 300 games, and white usually plays c3, but a4 sets up a very, very nasty trap. And again, I think rook b8 should be played. But if b4, queen c4, and bye-bye. Two traps in the Mackenzie variation. First of all, what's the Mackenzie variation? Well, after a6, bishop a4, knight f6, d4. d4 is the Mackenzie variation. It's fairly aggressive. I wouldn't say it's optimal. Black is already equal, but okay. Now, black's best is ed4. This is thousands of games, but in this game, b5 was played. And b5 isn't the losing move or anything. It's just that white has a slight advantage. Again, after bishop b3, in this position, knight takes d4 was played. And knight takes d4 is already a considerable advantage. Probably d6 is the best move and the position is equal. After knight takes d4, knight takes d4. In this position, black really has to play c5. That seems absurd because you're a piece down, but you're going to go c4 and you're going to win the bishop. And this is the only way for black to play. This is similar to the Noah's Ark trap. But if ed4 recapturing the knight, then game over straight away. e5, the knight has 0 squares. It cannot go here. Cannot really go to e4 because of queen f3 double attacking f7 and the knight. These are covered. So let's say knight g8, the only move that doesn't lose the knight. Queen f3, and that's it. Queen e7 is the only way to defend. And now we pick up the rook. This, I think, could very likely happen. So if you play the Mackenzie variation, first of all, if you don't, you should try it. It's very fun. Some people are going to go b5, it's a natural move, bishop b3, and then people are going to take on d4 to free up this diagonal. And the knight cannot be taken. If the knight is taken, e5, and this is fairly similar to the Vienna Gambit, the game is over straight away. Another Mackenzie variation trap, so once again d4. Well, let's have a look at what happens on knight e4. This is another very rare move. Once again, e takes d4 is most common, and this is how the lines go. Castles, bishop e7, rook e1, and so on and so on. But if they take on e4, we can play queen e2, which is the best move, and it should be about equal. But we can also try d5. Now, d5 is a bad move. This is the game Capablanca-Meyer from 1908. But d5 is not easy to meet. Black should continue knight c5, counter-attacking the bishop. That's the only good move. Knight e7 was played in the Capablanca game. Now it's already equal. Knight e5. b5 was played. which is an advantage to white. He should have gone knight c5 again, but okay, b5, bishop b3, and bishop b7. And now it's game over already. Instead of bishop b7, he should have gone d6. I mean, it's very clear that something nasty is about to happen. The engine gives queen e2 as the best move, which is okay, and after knight d6 it wants to go h4. I don't think humans would play this. A more human way to play this is what Capablanca did, d6, and even though this should be equal, after knight takes d6, queen takes d6, or a slight advantage, it's still more understandable for white to go for this. Of course, you cannot take the queen because there is checkmate on f7. So let's say they don't take the queen. Let's say they go knight d5. Then we can simply go queen d5, bishop d5, and bishop d5, and this should be about level. You have a queen for 3 pieces, or sorry, black has a queen and a pawn for 3 pieces. So it's a fairly interesting trap. So if knight e5, b5, bishop b3, bishop b7, again, the best engine line is queen e2, and that's about +3. d6 is about equal, but black has to be extremely careful. Knight d6 is the only move. First of all, we're threatening mate. Queen d6, the queen cannot be taken. And knight d5 is the only move, forcing white to give up the queen. But again, it's a queen for a bunch of pieces. I mean, I'd prefer to be white here. So it's 2 knights and the bishop for a queen and a pawn. The final 2 traps will be in the Cozio Defense, which is knight g7. Now this is very popular, and I think high-rated players play this all the time. It's a slightly offbeat way to fight the Ruy Lopez. So c3, one of the main moves, a6, and in this position bishop a4 is more common than bishop c4, but bishop c4 is probably playable. After bishop c4, it should be about equal. And black played h6 for some reason. I don't understand h6. So this, I mean, this could happen. It prevents knight g5, but I think a much better attempt, well, I think a much better attempt is d5, which is what you do in the Italian. So when there's a bishop on c4, and now if e d5, knight d5, you just get rid of the issue very comfortably. So h6 seems kind of unnecessary, but okay. White is better, but it's not the losing blunder. Now in this position, white should castle, but let's say d4, which is also good. And e d4 should be played. But if d6, we can now go queen b3, double attacking f7. And again, d5 is the only move. If d5, then white has an advantage. Bishop d5, knight takes d5, e takes d5, knight e7, and c4. White has this tremendous central position, central pawn structure, and white is a pawn ahead. However, after queen b3, black can lose the game in a single move. Knight a5, mate in 3, bishop takes f7, king d7, and now simply knight e5 check. And you have to take because it's mate, and when you take, it's mate anyway. This to me seems like a very natural mistake black could play. After queen b3, knight a5, if you're not careful, hangs checkmate. The final one is a queen sac. Again in the Cozio, so knight g7, c3, d6 is fine, d4 main lines, main lines, main lines, knight g6 is the main line. And in this position, d5 should be played. That's the best move. You can also go bishop e3 or rook e1 or knight bd2. There are many moves. But knight g5. Knight g5 is a tricky move that gives white a slight advantage. It has only been played once, and it's not easy to respond to. Well, what's the idea? The idea is to attack on f7 before black has time to do anything sensible. So if, for example, bishop e7, then we just drop the knight back and okay, we admit that we did nothing. Okay, but if h6, which is a good move, we have a trick. We take on f7. It's technically losing for white, but it's so hard to play for black that I would actually do this in a tournament game. I should say that after h6, the best move is again knight f3. But knight f7, king f7 has to be played. And now bishop c4, check. You don't really have too many options. If you go bishop e6, then d5 forks the pieces and white is up material. So you have king e7, probably, or king e8. If king e8, then we go queen h5. And after queen h5, you have to defend the knight. So queen f6, and now simply f4. And black is slightly better according to the engine, but good luck. I mean, good luck defending this. This seems to me like a perfect position. But the losing blunder in this position, which seems fairly natural, is king e7. And we go queen h5, attacking the knight. The best move is queen c8, although good luck understanding that. And after queen c8, we just pick up the knight on g6. But most people are going to go queen e8 defending the knight. And now, queen g5 check, ag5, and bishop g5 checkmate. This trap is the most likely of all to happen in an actual game, I believe. So if they go for the Cozio defense, all of this is mainline stuff. And after knight g5, h6 is the best move according to the engine, and it's very understandable. So we have a slightly worse position. Bishop c4, and of course king e8 once again is forced, but after queen h5, we go f4. If king e7, then it's game over. So these are the traps I wanted to show you. I hope you like them. Once again, if you have any traps to add, please comment below. Let me know what they are. I would like to make part 2 of this video. Thank you very much. Stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.